Good afternoon. My name is Paul Hayes. I am going to be speaking to you as your opening speaker. I'll also be your cut-rate MC for today because Mark Little was washing his hair or something like that. Really a glorified traffic cop who will keep things moving along at a smart pace. I, unfortunately, know nothing about social, so I'm going to set the tone and wallow in my ignorance. But the 6 speakers that come after me know everything about it, so that's where you're actually going to learn. In the meantime, I'm going to bring you through the old-fashioned tenets of what you need to do to get your startup, your company out there in the world making a difference. So, PR for startups, adventures in tech marketing. I've been working for 20 years. I'm as old as your parents, I'm afraid. In technology, I started with a games middleware physics engine company called Havoc about 15 years ago. Some PlayStation and Xbox people might know that if you're nerdy enough. And that was great fun in California. And then went through Demonware and a load more games without ever having played games. I was like a drug dealer, didn't take my own stuff. And then I've continued to build a business that works with the leading technology companies in the world. So you might know some of these people. These are the kind of leading, we work with a lot of US multinationals as well, but I thought what might be more interesting for you is the work that we do with great Irish product builders. Hopefully some of you will be working for them in the years to come. Some of you might know Intercom. They took over the old Anglo-Irish bank to exorcise it of its ghosts and evils. And they've raised 135 million now, and I think they'll be well on its way to being the first indigenously led Irish unicorn in the tech-specific sector. Messaging and what's happening there. I'm going to come back to some of the stuff they do, especially around social later on, because while I know nothing about social, I know what it looks like when it's done well. Nearform down the bottom left are quite interesting. They are a Tremor company because the bright lights of Waterford were too racy for them, and now they're the largest Node.js company in the world out of Tremor. And they have close to 100 world-class techies working for them, working for some of the biggest companies in the world. So it just shows you can do it anywhere and everything in between. Currency Fair is the first peer-to-peer marketplace for currency transfer, and I'm going to get into some of the instances where they can, or how they've made an impact in the world. So here's the thing. Everybody in their company or in their startup loves and lives and eats and breathes that startup. But nobody else gives a shit. Everyone's over 18, I can swear, right? Nobody cares. You've got to resist the temptation to talk about yourself. You've got to talk about only your impact on the world. Fit yourself into the bigger stories, the bigger trends in the world, and redefine what those trends are by virtue of the fact that you're in it. I'm going to keep coming back to this, but if you can figure this out, it's the thing that'll keep on giving back to you. You are only interesting to yourself and maybe your mother. You're not interesting to anyone else in terms of what you do right now as a small startup. But if you can educate me or convince me that you know what's going on in the world and where the ball is going to hop in a year or a month or 18 months' time, then I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to listen to you for 2 reasons. I'm interested in where the world is going to go, but you're convincing me that you're going to have an impact on that world by showing me how the world is going to change by the time I get there. The more you talk about yourself and what you're doing right now, the more people think, this shit doesn't work. The trick, if there is such a trick to communications, is you're constantly selling the future and assuming the sale on what you've got right now. Because most startups are in a very vulnerable state in terms of what they've got right now. I'm working with some of the largest, most well-funded companies in the world, and I would not let you look inside them because it's a horrible sausage mashup. And you really have to, for thought leadership, you have to convince me you know where the market is going to go, or to use the sports metaphor, you know where the ball is going to hop, not where it is right now. Never talk about your technology in terms of where it is now. Tell me about where it's going and where it came from. So I want to know a little bit about your provenance. I want to know what county person you are. I want to know why you and your life experience leads you to this point in time where you know more about this market than anyone else. Because if you think of a company, and I try to break it down in terms of how we do international PR from here for companies, you're 3 things. Your talent, and that's binary, and we'll only know in retrospect whether you had it or not. Your financial ability, whether you're bootstrapped or you've raised, and that again is binary, and normally you'll either have it or you won't. After that, your market domain expertise. You know something about this marketplace that no one else does. That's what you're convincing journalists, VCs, customers, partners about. And if you can't convince them of that, if you can't paint a valid picture of that, nobody's going to buy from you, invest in you, or write about you. Make the story about more than you. I guess this is 3 ways of saying the same thing. The most powerful thing you can do is actually write the guidelines for your sector, redefine it. Great journalists, like great investors, they want to know about news stories. They want to know, how is the world going to move on because you exist within it. I met the founder of Havoc, Steve Collins, this morning, and I hadn't seen him in a long time. And he's just joined Frontline Ventures as a VC. And back in the day, we were trying to sell physics engines to computer games. And this was PlayStation 1 time, before many of you, but not all of you, were born. And nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted it as a concept. So we came up with the idea of physics, and we wrote the rules for it. We wrote the rules that, you should be able to stack more than 5 objects. Again, remember, it was PlayStation 1 time. You should be able to stack them stably, and that you should be able to have a rubber ball within your game, and you should be able to have cloth and hair and particles. And some of this stuff was aspirational. And we had a competitor at the time called Math Engine, which is a very good descriptor of what a physics engine is, but we were called Havoc. We were about the effect of what was going to happen. What was great about that was when we came out with the 5 rules of physics, it got journalists and VCs interested in it at all as a concept, but we controlled the narrative. Not what the company was doing, but what the sector was doing. We invented a new sector. You have to invent the new sector that your company is the proof of. Become the proof. Otherwise, you're the person that goes into a bar, sits down behind a stranger, and goes, "I'm great." And we all know those type of people, and they're a little bit creepy. You need to move it to the stage where you go, "Did you see the way the world is going?" when you're sitting in that bar. And at the end of the night, the whole bar comes to the conclusion, those people are great. They know more about the world than I do, and they've really educated me. Therefore, I would like them to be more in my life, be that in my investment fund, or in the New York Times, or on CNBC, or on whatever little trade mag that actually moves the needle and gets you some customers. Don't always go for the glamour shots. I'm going to come back to that as well. But you can literally write the rules for where your sector is going. Usually 2 of them you can do, 2 of them everyone should be able to do it in a while, and 1 should be so impossible that everybody wants to write and talk about it. This is really where content comes from, really interesting content. And what you're doing then is controlling the narrative so your competitors go crazy because they know they can never do some of the other stuff, but people are talking about the concept, not your company. You're only interesting once to journalists. Profiles on your company are only interesting once. You need to move the narrative on to serious journalists to become part of a bigger trend story. And then you bounce along the top of consciousness rather than have to constantly raise your game. This is just a little practical thing. Press releases are for 2 things only. Again, I go back to, I'd like to insult my audience up front. You're not that interesting. And if you're in a startup, and I suppose I take it from very much a startup perspective, the only 2 things that I care about are you going to survive? Not can you do what you say you can do, it's can you survive alone? Because 90% of your companies won't. This is welcome to the wonderful life of being an entrepreneur. You'll be fine as an individual, it's just 90% of the ideas you have, especially if they're venture backed, will never come to fruition. So most people's problem with startups isn't can you do it, it's will you survive? So money raised at least gives you a year, 18 months runway, and that's all you want to hear about. Or if you've landed your first customer, that answers 99% of the other questions, which is, has someone else been crazy enough to try this first so I won't get fired if it's a complete mess? Those first customers, get them in any way you can, and make sure that there's a marketing agreement in place so that they will actually speak about you, because that's your endorsement. So write a press release so everyone's on the same page, and then resist the temptation to send it. Because every journalist worth their salt knows that every other journalist has that press release, and therefore it wasn't that interesting in the first place, and now it's even less interesting because it's diffused amongst all journalists. There are 7 journalists in the world that you need to get to know if you want to make an impact with your company. And in every city, market, or country, they're the same. Now, forgive my old-fashioned nomenclature here, but it's 2 dailies, 2 Sundays, a radio, a TV, a general tech, and then a specialist trade tech in the sector you're in. Is that 7? Did anyone do the counting? I think it's 4. Might be 8. There are 8 journalists you need to know. Anyway, that's the same the world over. We do that for our clients in Dublin, we do that in London, we do it in New York, we do it in San Francisco, we do it in Sydney, we do it in Hong Kong. And if you can get those 7 to 8 types of journalists, the problem is you have to give each of them a different angle. So your company, again, won't be that interesting in itself. You need to come up with the different angles in the world that your company might be the proof of and go to those journalists and develop relationships. The most long-serving relationships are going to be the ones where you become a source and get nothing from it for the first 3 or 4 times. Think of it as dating. We all try to be cool and very, I don't need you, you don't need me, we're just being cool here. This is what's happening. Become a good source for journalists and they'll trust you for life. Or at least the 18 months you need them until you get your 3rd round and you're a millionaire and then they want to take pot shots at you. But that's a beautiful day as well. Then you hire someone like me to keep you out of the papers. That's a whole other presentation. Okay, the next point I wanted to make was, allow me to contradict myself. Talk early, openly, and often. I went to California for the first time 20 years ago, and I thought, my God, and our next speaker's from California, so I'm kind of partially slagging him. Aren't they all very naive? They're so open and trusting. They're telling everybody everyone's idea, and there's no NDAs, and there's no nothing. It turns out that's how great ideas spread, not to get all TED on you, but you need to get out there as early as you can and bring people into the fold as early as you can and be completely open, because there are no new ideas, none. There are 15% better iterations with the right team and the right timing and the right funding, but there are never any new ideas. You're just going to, there was search before Google. They did it 15% better every year, as it turns out. But that's where you're going to get to. You need to be as open as possible. What's beautiful, and I might be coming at this a little too early for you guys, still cocooned in this wonderful university, but advisory boards are the most fun thing ever, because they're not the same as actual boards with all those fiduciary duties and legal obligations. Advisory boards mean nothing other than, can I buy you a cup of coffee? If you have a hero in your sector or area of interest or area of study, send them an email. Ask them, are they ever going to be in Dublin? Or can you meet them anywhere for just a cup of coffee or a Skype call? It's amazing how much people want to give back. And if you ask them for that favor, there's a cognitive dissonance thing, I think, where they become tied up in your success. And you can put together an amazing advisory board with no money at all, just a dream and an aspiration and the price of a cup of coffee. If you really get into it and you want a real one, you go for 2 customers, 2 partners as an exit. Just don't tell them who they really are. You've got targets, imaginary targets on their heads. And that's what that can get you much more credibility than you're ever going to get yourself and in terms of where you need to go. Okay, this is the topic for today. I'm going to admit my complete ignorance, just that I know how important this is now and how it's transforming my own PR industry, and tell you an anecdote. So about 2.5 years ago, a guy called John Collins, who was the deputy editor of the Irish Times, came to me and said that Intercom, this Irish tech company, wanted to hire him as a managing editor. And he said, what the hell is the managing editor of a tech company, and what would I be doing? And I was going, well, I don't know, but let's go and figure it out. And it turns out that they had early on seen the significance of where content was going and that they wanted to be the best in the world on product building. They wanted thought leadership on it, and they had huge goals. So they went after a deputy editor of the Irish Times and said, write us a newspaper. And he asked, well, what does that mean? And he said, why do people read the Irish Times? And when you analyze it, it's for 70% interesting content and 30% advertisement, as with all websites, newsletter, any journalism at all. He said, do the same for us. Write 70% blog posts that are just really interesting to the dev community in the world, and 30% lightly veiled advertorial, which does incorporate what we do. And entertain people, delight them first, so that they will take the medicine of what our tech does. And Intercom are a very interesting company. They have seeded the existing internet. And by that they mean they don't want anyone that already has a large online presence. They're going after you, which are devs and business people who haven't even invented their new company yet. They want the next 15% of global commerce. And so they're going after people with no money who are studying in their dorms, and they just want to be used by them. And so if you look at the Intercom blog, not to give them too much of a plug, but they've got 250,000 people reading it. I know our next speaker is an avid reader of it, and they've become the very best in the world on thought leadership, on product building, and they're down on Stephen's Green. And it's amazing. He now has 250,000 people reading it. I don't know what the readership of the Irish Times was, but it was 75,000, 100,000. And that's what real content means at its very best. Every one of you can do that, and there are people smarter than me that are going to get into how and the wherefores and how you get it out there. But remember, they're just new instruments. Nothing has changed. Great content, finding the right people and resonating with them is still the name of the game. And then it's whether it's shared, earned, owned. Unfortunately, and let me be the first to invoke the orange Oompa Loompa, Donald Trump, while he might be bad for humanity, he is the ultimate proof that, earned media beats bought media any time. Hillary spent hundreds of millions on ads, and he spent nothing. He was outrageous, and it's bad for humanity, but I'm just saying, being a venal business guy, it's an amazing proof in terms of the efficacy of that particular channel. Okay, political lesson over. How do you do corporate PR? How do you do, and again, think of this in terms of social and where it gets to. This is a client of ours, Currency Fair, had raised 10 or 15 million. They need to be a big deal in London because that's where their big competitor who's raised 100 million is based, but no one wanted to do the story. So you have to storyboard. You have to make yourself part of a bigger story. So the headline here, I'm too embarrassed because it was such made-up horseshit. I don't know how I got away with it. It was that Dublin was coming to eat London's lunch for fintech, which we all know isn't entirely true, but it might be true. So I did a story. I brought together those 6 or 7 people to say different things. Column Line and Relex had just had an exit. Accenture always have a report that says something. KPMG always have a report that contradicts it. And you pull it together and you go to the journalists in London and go, here's an interesting story that's 70% gift wrapped. Do you want to go and do your own work on this and try and journalists are busy, not lazy. If you can bring the elements of the story to them and it's a bigger, interesting story, then they're going to get there. So CNBC, Wall Street Journal, New York Times wrote this story, but it was really about the third paragraph where Currency Fair said, the way we see the world going is this. This goes back to what I was saying at the start of this conversation about the most dangerous place in the world for your company to be is in the headline, because you're only interesting once and you're not that interesting. And any story where you're in the headline is going to attract a very, very small number of people who are, your landlord and your mum and someone else. You want to be in an interesting story where the headline is about huge trends in the world, and then you want to be in the third paragraph, being the arbitrator, the referee of where the world is going, telling people what's changing in the world, what the major trends are. It's like chairing your own conference. By the way, the other advice I can give you is always throw your own conference. If that's 10 people in a hotel room just drinking coffee, every conference started like that. And resist the temptation to speak at your own conference. Chair it. It elevates you 10 times higher than you're going to be if you actually speak. I don't know what that old joke about is, don't have all the world think you're a fool and then open your mouth and confirm it by speaking. But if you can chair something, people just see that you understand more about the context of what's going on. And it's the same with being in press stories. Be the arbitrator, be the referee, be in the third paragraph, don't be in the headline. And you come across much smarter than I am right now. This is my favorite thing. All Irish tech companies, there's a hiring drought on at the moment. Good news for you guys is there are 5 jobs for each of you if you graduate. I know I can see 3 or 4 of you that won't because of the drinking and the whatever. You'll be fine. The C's always end up hiring the A's, so be a B. But there's a huge fight on. It's not quite Silicon Valley proportions, but it's out there. So every tech company that comes to us goes, just make us cooler than Google or Facebook, because they're just snapping everybody up. And the way we do that is, it might sound a little faluting to you guys at the minute, but beyond the free meals and the good salaries and the benefits and everything else, it's a sense of meaning and purpose. I can guarantee if you go to Google or Facebook, you will have an amazing experience, but you will not make any impact on the product there. If you're good enough, they'll suck you back to Mountain View, where you might make an impact on the product. But if you want to make an impact on the product every week and actually have a sense of meaning in the work you're doing, go into an Irish startup. It's a phenomenal moment right now where we're in the kind of middle cycle of a second cycle of VC funding. So it's like early Valley. We're in the 1970s of where Silicon Valley was. But there are really, really well-funded companies that are going to take on the world. We work with some of them, but we can see it in terms of what's going to happen. So I would advise all of you, no matter what you're studying or no matter what you're doing, get into a well-funded Irish startup. even if you think it's not the new, the problem is Irish mammies and daddies think the new job in the bank or in the civil service is the job in Google or Facebook. But if you want a sense of meaning and be trained for life and be employable for life, even the Facebooks and the Googles, and I'm using them as an example, it's any other multinational or any other company, they want you to have been through a failed startup. It is the badge of honor. Just as a side note, I have made failure my profession. I messed up at various trade shows and things, and I spent 10 years in California hiring sillier vehicles and kind of doing guerrilla PR. And then I formed a club called Flounders for Failed Founders, which happens around the Web Summit every year. And thanks to the DCU Ryan Academy, who I'm here today for as well, we set up the Startup Wakes. And we now do Startup Wakes around the world where we bury dead startups. It sounds a bit silly and frivolous, and it is silly. We drink a shot of whiskey and sing the parting glass because you're not allowed to burn business plans anymore inside buildings. Health and safety, Jesus. But there's a serious point to it, which is people don't talk about failure anymore, where actually it's where you learn about most. Most people who are successful in their own way, through their own set of circumstances, and you actually have very little to learn from them. Most of the business books I've read by successful people are, well, I can't replicate this. This was your set of circumstances. You didn't have signposts when you were doing this, but you can learn from failure. It stings, it's horrible, I'm not trying to gloss over it, but if you can get people to really open up about where things went wrong, and that's what the Wakes try to do, it can be really, really valuable to you. So, hang around with more losers. I know most of you do already, but now just embrace it. Don't feel bad about it. Losers are good for you. This is my favorite thing. This guy was a student, I think he might have been here. Anyway, basically the 6 o'clock news, back when Job Bridge was going on, wanted to do a story on companies that would exploit people through unpaid internships, something I'm sure a lot of you have come across. So we said we'd be the counterfactual to that, and Currency Fair was going from 100 people to 200 people quickly. They just raised a big round. So I found this poor hapless student, much like you today, and we brought him out, and I manufactured a complete story about how they were going to hire this guy straight out of college because he was a genius, and that they would treat him right. This was Caroline's first day as head of HR. She went into all this. This was 6 or 7 minutes on the 6 o'clock news. Kevin Holler had a platform which was about finding the very best students to go in and work in technology companies. So he got to be the third-party endorsement. He was like the middle paragraph guy who went, these guys do it right, the rest of the companies don't. Job Bridge is awful. You've got to treat people right, and off you go. Now, if this had been a press release, this would have been, Currency Fair might hire an intern, which isn't exactly news to anybody. But it became a huge thing and a huge talking point, and it reverberated for weeks because they were doing it the right way. And it gave them a huge amount of PR. So I guess the point here is you've got to think about what platform you're speaking on and craft the story so that it makes the impact. Product PR, I won't dwell on this, but for trust and credibility and fundraising, it tends to be mainstream media. To get customers, to sell product, it tends to be very nerdy trade press. InfoQ is where all the CIOs in the world go. That's where you want to get to. And you want to use your customers to get on there because they're more interesting than you as you get there as well. So, funny anecdote, I've had Currency Fair on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNBC, BBC. It's all been great. The #1 sign-up mechanism for Currency Fair is Costa del Sol Radio. 1.2 million retired Brits on the Costa del Sol that need to move their pensions every month from Britain down to Spain. And Costa del Sol radio is like bad hospital radio, but we are all over it like a rash. So you can't be a snob about these things. You've got to find out the watering holes your customers are at and then go find them. Event PR, I don't know if any of you were, Intercom did a thing in the Mansion House on product PR. Then we went around Europe, London, Paris, Berlin, Tel Aviv. It was the Eurovision version of Europe about how to build great products. And then we did it in 6 cities in the US. And then we came back and we filled the Olympia with 1,600 people on product. As a human being, I weep in despair when techies think that they're rock stars, but as a marketeer, it was kind of a cool night, and it really set the tone. If you can't put it on a t-shirt, nobody cares about your features and benefits. That's as deep as they want to go. Most of you probably won't have had this experience, but back in the old days, when you'd be handing a brochure to someone and they'd smile, that was the smile of never having to think about you again until they actually had to. So don't mistake that for actual selling. This is when I messed up. I built a huge stand in San Jose for $250,000 punts, again, a currency that didn't exist before many of you were born. Probably might exist again soon if Italy goes the way of Greece. You might get used to it. But I started hiring buses and RVs. We couldn't even afford tickets to trade shows. Turns out people hate trade shows. And when there are Irish guys out the back with laptops and beer, and you can just put your feet up for half an hour, that's all they want. So we spent a good 10 years doing that. This is kind of the last slide. That's the Staples Center in LA, where cooler things happen. This was E3, it was some big trade show. That's a London double-decker bus for some reason. For 5 years I drove around selling technology companies on the back of that. That's Wired, that's CNN. I'm the most important person on the bus because I'm the one handing out the mojitos. People remember how you make them feel. They remember very little of what you say to them, but they'll always take the call when they have that feeling of how you made them feel. Always buy the first drink and the last drink of the night. Okay. Oh, I thought it was the last one. This is entirely irrelevant to you. When you get middle-aged and the belly isn't going away and you've been drinking for 15 years, you have to put on Lycra and embarrass yourself around the world. So that's what I do now. I bring anyone that's had 100 million exit, I bring them around the world cycling. I'm almost embarrassed to say that in front of you with your whole lives in front of you, but this is what success looks like in middle age. That might be the least inspiring thing anyone has ever said from this stage, but it's good fun. So everyone there, apart from me, has sold out for 100 million. I guess the real answer is none of them are any happier or any more miserable than they were when they were your age. It's not about the money. You'll have changed or they will have changed. Do something interesting as you go along. Don't look for the goal because the goal will have changed. It's not that. You've got to squeeze your crack out as you go along because you never know where you're going to end up. That's it. That makes no sense at all, but it's a recap. That's me, and I will be your MC for the rest of the day. I think I've already gone over, so apologies. And next up we have, from Voice Sage, Matthew Whale, Head of Product. Thank you.